But anyway, thank you for joining us for round 2 of the Rules Advisory Committee for the Division 126 rulemaking that the Oregon Department of State Lands is doing. I'll pop my camera on here too so you could see me as I talk. So once again, my name is Chris Parkins. I manage the Bend field office, and I'll just do a quick roster check of, or just kind of rattle off who's here. So from the Department of State Lands, we have Amber McKernan and Sheena Miltenberger, who both will be alternating some presentation time today so they can introduce themselves more formally at that time. We also have Erin Sarah behind the scenes again, our prolific note taker who did an amazing job last time. And apparently we didn't break her because she's back. So thank you, Erin, for that. We will do a check with Erin, perhaps when we get through with the roster check here and make sure she's hearing us okay and everything is going fine. And so with that, I'll just rattle off who we have here. We have Chip from SmartLink ATT, John from OPB, Steve from Harney County School District, Lori from the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians, Gabe of ODOT, Cassie of the Coquille Indian Tribe, Stephanie Bowen of Harney County Electric, and Travis of Lumen CenturyLink. So thank you for 100% attendance today. I hope you have your sleeves rolled up. This is going to be a pretty serious work session. We don't have to go through all of the background that we did on the first meeting because we all know why we're here. But I will go over the agenda before we dive in, and then we'll get to work. So again, this will be much more of a work session. We're hoping for some good dialogue, but we'll start off with presenting some background materials that you have seen and did receive an email, but we'll present some of that on the screen and then dive into the draft review where we left off last time as promised. And before we dive into that business, Erin, are you hearing us okay?
Yes, I am.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you for note taking again. And I would just like to ask, as a matter of protocol, that the first time or two that you speak, it seemed to go pretty fluidly last time without having to unmute people, let them speak and mute them. So if you are speaking, please just introduce yourself by name again so that Erin kind of associate the voice with the notes. And it shouldn't take more than a time or two of that, but that helps a lot. Otherwise, she's trying to watch multiple screens and see who's talking. So with that, let's dive into the agenda. So today's agenda will kick off with a review of meeting number 1. Amber will lead us in that. And then Sheena will present the rate study results, which will be a good opportunity. That'll set some background for us later because we're going to go into the compensation section of the rules, and that really provides the background there. And really, that's the tool that helped us see what fair market values are and help us realize what targets we should be looking at for lease rates and such. So let's see, after that, we'll dive back into the review as promised where we left off. Amber and Sheena will alternate leading that and presenting. And we decided since this is a pretty serious work session, we're going to try not to waste people's time. And if we can get by with just one break, that's the target. So the midpoint will be at 3:35. We'll take a 10-minute break or so, see how everybody's doing. Before I hand the mic and screen over, Cassie has to leave at 3. Thank you for letting us know that, Cassie. Is there anybody else that has a time constraint that we should be aware of? Okay, thank you for that. And I should mention, in case you noticed, that one of our DSL team is missing this time. Last time we had Sean Zumwalt here as well, another one of our property managers. He was pretty quiet because he was ill that day, but he still came to the meeting. Well, he has since been activated in the National Guard again. So he's been working graveyard at a hospital, helping with COVID workload. So obviously that is for the good of the state. And, you know, we of course couldn't refuse to let him bow out of this meeting this time. So maybe we'll get to see him next time. With that, Amber, are you ready to give us a review about how meeting 1 went?
Sure. So we don't
necessarily have to dive into it, but we did want to open some space to make sure that we've captured everybody's comments correctly for the record. It was a summary that was sent out. So if there's anything that we've missed or that you think is misrepresented from what your comment might have stated, please let us know.
All right. Thank you for that, Amber.
Yeah. And we'll just move on if nobody has comments. So I think now would be the time to air any grievances.
I just wanted to use that as an opportunity to plug. We'll do it similarly this time. If we're kind of get the impression that we understand what someone's concern or question is, it may be that we then follow up after the meeting and edit the draft to reflect that, and then send it out to everybody. So just a reminder about how that worked before. All right, thank you, Amber. With that, Sheena, are you ready to take control of the screen?
Yeah, I have control. So
Okay.
we're on to rate studies. So you guys should have all received this. Can you guys all see table 1, communication lease rate study results?
Yep, looks good.
I see some nods, so thank you for that. And then the rent structure tables as well. You guys should have gotten that in the email as well. We're going to start with the rate study tables though. So, few things. First of all, we reached out to 20 states, including Oregon, and the BLM. We received information from 10 states, including Oregon. Obviously, we gave ourselves our answers for what we currently charge. One of the bottom lines that we found in this study is that everybody does things drastically different. It was very difficult to come up with any kind of comparison whatsoever because everybody's doing their own thing as far as communication site leasing. The states that did not respond either did not have ComSite leasing program or didn't even have state lands at all, or just plain didn't respond. So one of the things we learned was that compensation rates between different states were based off different values. So some states did appraisals for each and every lease, and that could have been for the term of the lease or on an annual basis. Some of them were determined based on the population of where the site was located. Some of them were based off the use types for their comp rates. Some utilized the BLM fee as a base and then had a bunch of add-on fees for like different types of equipment or per antenna or something like that. They also had add-on fees for like the impact of the site. So based on acreage or square footage of the site. Most had some sort of annual increaser for their leases if it wasn't based on like an annual appraisal. And all those annual increases were 2 to 3.5%. So that was like the only thing that was fairly similar across all these different states. The other major thing that we learned was that co-location for subleasing is really different as well. The sublease rates were highly variable. Some of them were a flat 25% of the base rate for that year. Some of them were also done by appraisal. So there wasn't a whole lot of ability to compare on some of those things. So one of the things is to process all these different variables and rates, we essentially had to do averages of averages, when this is kind of what you see in table 1. So we essentially tried to, I guess, distill all the categories that in the information that we received from other states into categories that were similar to our proposed structure, use type structure. To kind of be able to compare apples to apples on this stuff. And that's kind of where we get these categories that you see here: the nonprofit, non-commercial, government emergency services, commercial, and cellular. And you can kind of see that in the gray up here, and then in the orange here, kind of how other people this is some terminology that was kind of came from other states. So we just kind of tried to distill it down into these categories that are said here in the gray. So that's kind of how we got this information. We reached out, and it was really kind of difficult to kind of get some comparisons. So did anybody have any questions kind of going through these papers? John, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I have a question. On the far right of the chart where it says cellular and commercial cellular,
Mhm.
The numbers there seem odd to me.
Yes.
Can you tell us maybe what happened, or
Yeah,
why
so
that may be?
the way we received some of the data from other states is it didn't delineate between commercial and cellular. So some other states have cellular under a commercial category, and we didn't receive information that kind of split those hairs for us. A lot of times we did try to follow up with these states, and we may or may not have gotten a response depending on the state. We actually got some initial information from several states, but it was so jumbled together that we couldn't make heads or tails of what the lease was like, what the rate was for. And that's kind of where we understood it to be like commercial, but we weren't sure if it was cellular or not, or that kind of thing.
So that right column, maybe some small sample size going on, because it's weird that it's $3,000 for the low and 36 for the high,
Yeah.
and that's a much larger range than the column right next to it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it just depended on how the information came to us, because like I said, that it really made it difficult to compare anything, the way everybody does something different. And then again, it also could have been based off, I mean, it's 3,000 to 36,000. Some of this information came from highly populated areas like outside Phoenix, which is a big city, so it was gonna have a higher lease rate. So it was that kind of thing. Kind of the bottom line is this comparison simplified. This kind of table down here, this is essentially our market. This is what we distilled down to be our market rates. So Chip, I saw your box highlighted earlier. Did you have a question as well?
Oh, no, thanks. John covered it for me.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, John.
So was there any other questions on kind of how on these tables or anything? Chip, your box is highlighted again. Did you have anything else?
No, not sure what's highlighted. I just unmuted or muted myself.
So I think this might be a fair time to point out that due to our common school fund obligations, we are required to get fair market value for lease rates. So we've shown the averages, the average of the lows across the 11 sources that we got information from, 10, and then our own rates. And then we've averaged the highs as well. One thing that I noted in the email that was sent out with all this information is that when we drafted the rules, our government and emergency services rate was set below what the average of the low is for the market value as determined by this rate study. So that is something that we need to look at and adjust. And we didn't quite have all the information ready to go because we'd been waiting for states to respond. So this was a best guess that came out low.
So can you say that? I'm not sure I caught that again. Are you saying that the $2,000 that was proposed for government emergency services, you're expecting to modify to go up?
This one, when we put in the proposed rates in the draft rule, we were still working on these figures and gathering information. When we finally got basically all we thought we were going to get, and we finally ran the final numbers, we realized this was pretty low for market value.
And do you anticipate it going above commercial? Because you've got some weird numbers going there too, where you have a tighter range on the government emergency services than you do on the the nonprofit, non-commercial services?
So the government emergency services, the low market value was 4,118, and then the high was 10,000. So, we at least need to be in that market range, in that value somewhere. I don't think we would want it as high as commercial. No, it doesn't make sense for that to be as high as commercial.
Is
But
there a
that's what we
is there
wanted.
a value judgment here to make about whether we think emergency services are more important than a general nonprofit category?
We
Uh,
would certainly collect comments.
Mhm. Yeah, that's kind of why we want to talk about rates, is make sure we're being fair, but we're also honoring our fiduciary responsibilities.
And we're doing that later, or are we doing that now?
We can jump into the draft and start looking at those rates, but we wanted to make sure there wasn't any questions through these tables to keep these numbers in mind while we're going through fees and compensation rates. So if that's all the questions on any of these tables, then yeah, we'll move on to the draft.
Let's look at table 2 real quick. So if we increase the government and emergency services rates, so that is going to change the non-commercial numbers. So we wouldn't be looking at losing revenue in the next 10 years. And I do want to point out that this table 2, was based on the lease rates as they are today and exactly as they would be when a lease renews. So if a lease renews in 3 years, that's when the future rates would kick in based on the numbers that you're seeing here. So if we left our government emergency services rates at $2,000 in the next 10 years, we would end up losing about $100,000 over a 10-year lease term. So if we increase that, we wouldn't be seeing a negative in that category. And if we bumped it up to the average low that we see in the rate study, it would double the total of the difference that you're seeing in that first gray column. So our total revenue increase over the first 10 years would be about 370,000. So that would be an increase in revenue based on the increase in rates. And then I do want to say too that we don't see a huge difference in our increase in revenue in years 1 through 10. And that's because we have a few leases, 2 of which are cellular, which would be definitely on the higher end of the rent scale. And they don't renew until 2031. So there's we can't realize increased revenue from those leases until after year 10, essentially. So that's why the jump in the revenue increase is so big when you look out to 20 years. Is there any questions we can answer on table 2?
Yes, I'm just not quite sure how to phrase it.
Okay.
So it looks like you took all of your existing leases and calculated what that revenue is going to make over time. And you did that with consideration of when those leases were supposed to end.
Yes.
And that's your current rates.
Yeah, so the blue columns are current rates.
This one right here.
Yeah, and so on the current rates, if those leases renewed, the rates just started over. So if you're a non-commercial paying $3,000 and you run out to the end of your lease term, then they started over at $3,000, because we don't have anything currently in rule that says those rates keep increasing once they end. And basically the rates that we have set, don't necessarily continue into the next lease term at this point in time. On the future rates, the way that we worded the rules was that the rates would continue the 3% increase once a lease renewed, unless another rate study is completed. So the future rates are basically a 3% increase continuously through year 20. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I'm following how you calculated your future rates on your existing leases.
Okay, so the leases as they are, let's take the example, a lease expires in 3 years. So the future rates wouldn't kick in until that expiration.
Okay,
And then you would start at what our proposed rate was.
so
So
for any particular lease, let's say you have a lease with AT&T, and you have a lease that expires in 3 years, and they're paying X amount right now, which is higher than what your current rate is. So they're paying, so the future rates has that 3 years built in, plus what they would start on the renewal period, which is a step back. Is that how you calculated future rates? Or did you calculate future rates starting the date the rules are effective and everyone got sort of a rent break at that point?
no, so the future rates wouldn't kick in until they expired. So every lease that we have in place right now is honored until its expiration date.
Okay, at its existing rates, and then
Mhm.
they would have a reduction in rate, and that's, so years 1 through 10 are taken into account that way.
Yeah, the cellular example, those rates wouldn't be reduced. The non-commercial show a reduction, and some of the commercial, it shows a reduction because of the category. Because we categorized the commercial into 3 different levels. And so the lease that we have that fits that would have been reduced based on the commercial category that it would fit. But the cellular leases would not see a reduction in rent. And then if we bump up the government and emergency services rates, then there wouldn't be a reduction in rent on those either in the non-commercial columns.
Are there any other questions?
Probably, but I'll hold them for now.
We
Okay,
welcome the feedback. So we do want to make sure that what we've proposed is meeting our fiduciary responsibility of getting market rates. And then also that it's doable and workable for our lessees. So we're expecting quite a bit of discussion on the co-locator topic. So do we want to look at the other 2 tables and then jump into the draft?
certainly can.
So table 3 just kind of shows the spread of leases and when we expect them to renew based on the categories. So we have 21 total leases. What we realized was that half of those just about are government and emergency services. So that could be local, county government, state government, federal government, 911 dispatch, those types of things. So that turned out to be kind of half of our lessee base, which was a good thing for us to realize. And then table 4, this table is a little bit arbitrary because this is just kind of a snapshot in time. If everything were to renew in exactly the same year, this would be the difference that we would be seeing in year 1 of the rent versus year 10 of the rent. So that was just kind of a snapshot in time. This would be an overall difference if everything renewed right now. And that's just kind of to show where we would see losses versus gains in our proposed rates.
I must not be following something because I only see maybe you have maybe you have 2 very long-term nonprofit leases that are not reflected in table 3. Is that how that works?
In table 3,
Yeah.
will you scroll back up, Sheena?
Yep.
Nonprofit, non-commercial, we just have 1, but government, and so in that top bar where they're colored, there's the blue for non-commercial, pink for commercial, and gray for cellular. So nonprofit and non-commercial all kind of fall in that non-commercial category. And other than that, we don't have
Aren't those the same
So-
categories in table 3 and 4?
I see what John's pointing out is on the third row down under non-commercial on table 4, that it calls out 3 leases. That's
So
what
there's
his
3 here
point
and
is
there's 1
versus
here.
1. Yeah.
Oh,
That's
The other
what you're
ones
seeing,
match
right,
out.
John?
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing.
all right. That's either, so that's a typo in one of the tables. I'll have to double check that.
Well, it's possible you have a very long-term lease that goes beyond 2033, or 2 of them.
I don't believe so. There's 3 there, 9 there. Nonprofit, non-commercial.
Yeah, let's take a look at that.
Yeah, so I think that's a typo on the 3. I think that we really only have 1 that fits the nonprofit, non-commercial. The rest are
So-
personal use, research, scientific, or government.
So this 3 here should be a 1.
Yes.
Okay, pretend this 9,000 is 3,000.
Does that affect your revenue numbers? Or does it just affect this particular table? Is it all one linked spreadsheet?
No, it'd just be
No.
that table.
It's also PDF, so.
Yeah.
Sorry, I can't change it, John.
Okay, so we have a question from Stephanie. Is it Harney Electric? Let me look at the greater spreadsheet.
You're it.
Give me just a moment, folks. I believe that it's OPB. I'm trying to figure out where I've categorized Harney Electric.
I just looked at our term. It's OPB. But I don't know where Harney Electric is then, which would be an interesting question too, right?
Correct.
Is it? Okay. Is this your personal cell? Oh, okay. I never noticed it till just now.
So the thing I didn't do in my spreadsheet was put the names of the lessees next to the numbers. So let me just figure out which number is Harney Electric.
Unless Stephanie knows her lease number off the top of her head.
She knows her lease payment.
408.
Whatever. Hey, is there a forklift behind?
Thanks for looking that
Randy.
up, Amber. While you're doing that real quick, I just want to make sure. Aaron, you're still hearing everybody okay?
Yeah, kind of hard to keep up, but I'm hearing you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well.
All right, you guys may have found the one error.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
Who would have bet if there was something there, I would have found it.
I know. So that must, okay, so we are missing at least 1 lease then in these calculations. I am happy to show you the giant table if you guys are interested in seeing that.
Put on your seatbelts.
Yeah, why don't you actually go ahead and show the giant table?
Okay.
I'll stop sharing for you even.
Let me,
Yeah, and
Okay, so here's where we've got all of the lease numbers, and this is where I didn't put names next to it, so that probably would have helped. But I'm not seeing Harney Electric's number in here, so they would,
4340.
yeah.
Stephanie just chimed in.
43408.
Yep.
So here's where we've got all the government emergency services. We have a research scientific, non-commercial, nonprofit. Oh, okay, so that was a typo then. So the 3 was correct and the 1 wasn't. And it might be that I didn't include these 2 because we might expect these to not continue leasing. But that's, at this point in time, that's a typo. So Harney Electric would fit in there because they are not for profit. So there's a lot going on in these tables. Basically, let's see if I can, so here would be, if we're looking at the future lease rent, these 2,000, that was the proposed rate for government and emergency services upon renewal. You could see this would be the very last fee that that particular lease paid before renewal would start. Where we see the big differences is down here. This is a cellular lease. So cellular is currently paying $10,000 a year with a 3% increaser, and that would increase to $20,000 a year in our proposed rates. So that's where we start seeing the bigger revenue jumps, is mainly in the cellular category. So if Harney County is the only one I missed, then we have 22 leases total. So this is our grand total revenue in 10 years with our proposed rates kicking in at the point of lease renewal.
Yeah.
And then 20 years, this is the total of lease years 11 through 20, and then grand total revenue with the proposed rates kicking in at the time of lease renewal over the next 20 years. So that would be about 3.8 million in 20 years in lease fees based on the leases that we currently have, accepting Harney Electric.
No, go ahead.
Any questions?
Thanks, Amber. That helped to dive back into the trenches there with the big table.
Yeah, so and then John, just to be more specific, these rates or the leases rent wouldn't start until 2022. So we calculated this from 2022 through 2041. So that would be the 20-year span that we're looking at in this study.
That's a lot of work.
Yes.
You're not kidding.
I've spent enough time in Excel to know that that's a lot of work, and I appreciate that work. I'm not terribly surprised that you missed one. I could see how that would happen.
Yeah.
And then making sure that you got all of the terms right so that they ended and started. I don't know if that's naturally your job, but I recognize that is a mammoth amount of effort right there. I do have on
Go
your
ahead.
lease rate study, when you asked about communication lease rates with your other states, that was for raw land, right? Or did that include power run to the site, or were there other things? How did you make sure that we were comparing apples to apples?
We reached out kind of, and this is actually something that most Western states with trust land actually do from time to time, is reach out to the leasing office or what have you, maybe an operations manager, and just say, hey, do you guys have communication sites? How do they operate? How do you run them? What do you charge for those? What are your compensation rates, application fees, stuff like that? So those were kind of the bigger questions, was was fees for applications and renewal applications, that kind of thing. Compensation rates, like what's the base rate? How do you calculate it? How do you determine it? Co-location or subleasing, how does that program work for them? What are the fees involved and that kind of thing? And a lot of them gave us some information on just how their program is run. So these are all established sites that they have and are currently leasing out, kind of like we do. We own the land, we lease the land out for these communication sites. States like Washington actually own their own equipment and towers, like the towers and the buildings and whatnot, and they lease space on the tower, which is not something that we do. So that immediately made that one hard to compare us to them, you know? And because of stuff like that, it is very difficult to compare because they really are scattered all over the board.
So is Washington's data in here or not in here?
I believe they are. I'd have to actually look. If I can somehow get out of Zoom to get to my desktop. Or Amber, do you have it open and can you look?
I'm trying to stop sharing. So
I think you
do.
could make the case that your rates are fine as they are without doing adjustments, and you're still complying with the public trust obligations you have based on the differences in your colleagues across the nation.
yeah, so Washington's information was included. And that's kind of why we did the averages and we looked at the average lows versus the average highs. And then, you know, some places and some sites are higher value property in urban areas versus rural areas. So some of our rates that we proposed are right in the middle, and then some of the rates that we proposed are to the lower end, knowing that most of our land is very rural. So
Exactly, and that's what I'm saying. Most of your land is very rural, and you're doing raw land. So some of
Right.
your subject matter colleagues in other states are skewing your results a little bit to the more expensive side because they're offering more than just raw land, and it's in places that is, well, not the middle of the country, not very rural. So I think you can make your argument that your rates are still complying with your trust obligations based on those differences. And I would float that for the rest of the group to consider as well.
So I think if we're ready, I'll get into the draft rules and we can look at these things while everybody kind of mulls over our market value. If that's all the questions from the rate study.
I don't see any hands up, Sheena.
Perfect.
Sounds good.
Okay, can everybody see this? Pretty
Yes.
good. All right, let me scroll down. And we will go over the changes to the draft that we made last meeting, and then we'll do those at the end. We'll go through all that at the end. So here we are with compensation, the section where we left off anyways.
Yeah, one of their tests had.
Does anybody have any comments about this? Just this first thing? Just says basically you guys got to pay rent. Okay, moving on. No comments. So here's the minimum base annual compensation for communication site facility leased will be the greatest of, and for non-commercial uses, these are the three the fees that we kind of propose.
Yeah.
I'm confused by your scheme here.
Mhm.
If it would have said minimum base compensation for communication site fills will be, and then colon, I would have understood it, but I don't know what the intent is of the greatest of. Is it if you fall in each of those categories?
There's more to come. There's some options.
Okay.
So these are the base where we start here at A. So here's all the non-commercial uses. This little B is all the commercial uses, and then all the subcategories that we have under that. And then little c is cellular, which is that third overarching category. Then we have a little d, which is the minimum bid when we have to do a public auction, which is honestly very rare. And then we have this little e. And this this is in case that maybe somebody wants to put a tower of some sort, maybe on our building in Salem, you know, that kind of thing. Or it's maybe it's a new site. You know, we want to develop a new site on a hilltop somewhere. We may want to do an appraisal on that land to determine a lease rate, depending. So that's why it says the greatest of, is because there's actually there's whatever category you fit into being the base, and then there's these two other potential
Yeah.
options.
And the minimum bid through auction, that has to stay, that's standard throughout all of our rules. So if we had competing applications, we could put it out to minimum bid or to public auction. And then knowing that our rates, as we've proposed them, are geared towards our more rural land where our communication sites currently exist. The requirement of an appraisal could be necessary in the event that we put a cell phone tower in the parking lot that we have in downtown Eugene. That would be a piece of land that doesn't necessarily fit the rates that we've identified in our different categories.
So let me see if I understand the way that you're attempting that this is supposed to work. You're a commercial user. You're in category B, unless you're in category D or E, a minimum bid category, or the department has done an appraisal. Is that the way this is supposed to read?
Yes.
So like 99% of the time, it's gonna be, the rate is going to be based off of these things that I have highlighted here. It's going to be the use category. These ones, not generally going to happen, but they need to be in there.
Right.
This last one is just an in case we have some weird thing happen, like Amber was talking about with the parking lot structure. And then the D is, we have to have that in there in case of the competing leases where we have to go through public auction. Or if somebody say abandons a site and we have a tower and a building sitting there and we want to maybe fill it, that's where we would throw it out for public auction.
I don't see that from the writing here, the drafting here, but I see what you're trying to do. I would suggest it might be clearer if instead of saying the greatest of, you struck that, and then in front of your E and D, you put a notwithstanding the rates determined in the section above. If rates determined under these two sections, if these two sections are applicable and the rates are higher, these rates will apply. Otherwise, I think you're going to have people reading this and wondering what's the greatest of within your categories. Or if you have people that are multiple use, like if you're a nonprofit, but you're also offering emergency services, that means it's $3,000 and not $2,000. So I think it's kind of confusing for me the way it is right now.
So John, what you said made sense there, especially about the notwithstanding clause, but what was your suggested? Oh, it looks like, never mind. It's already being edited as we talk.
I'm
Good
doing
job, Sheena.
that. I'm doing that. I was not understanding where he was going with
Yeah,
that.
I wanted
Now
to make
get
sure
it.
that we caught it in notes, but if you're doing it live, then that's even better.
I'm doing it live. So where did you want me to put notwithstanding?
So under D, in D, I would put notwithstanding the rate in. I would probably put a 3 and then renumber everything else. So your 3 becomes 4, your 4 becomes 5 in front of D.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I'd write notwithstanding anything in section 2, right?
Yes.
Yeah, notwithstanding anything in section 2.
Makes it more fun, right?
Rate, what do we call it? Is it the rate? The base annual compensation for any lease
Sounds good.
It's hard doing it in my head. I normally type. It makes a big difference for my brain.
I hear ya.
Will be determined under the following, under this section 3. For leases awarded through public auction and where the department has gotten an appraisal. You can clean this up a little bit, but you should
Yep.
be able to get the, right?
Mhm. I'm trying not to misspell too awful bad, so you guys won't make fun of me.
And then I would say if such amounts are greater. It's not perfect drafting, but it gets the concept down so that you can hone it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you. And that does make sense.
Yeah, I see what you're saying now. So now that we've kind of got that cleaned up, on non-commercial rates.
Yeah, so we don't have anybody representing research or scientific, but does it make sense the way that we've worded big A?
So, and to be clear, the reason why we want to allow a lump sum payment is because of the way grant funding works. We have several lessees doing research that have had difficulties because of the way grant funding operates.
We have a question from Stephanie Bowen. She's asking, what is personal? What's considered personal use?
Like ham radio. Does that answer your question, Stephanie? I can't see the chat, by the way, because I'm sharing and my chat like disappeared.
Yeah,
So
she's replying that she's going to bring it up again in co-location, but she's good for the moment, it sounds like.
fair enough.
Okay. So
Thank you, Stephanie.
government and emergency services then. So we have Gabe representing ODOT. So if this was bumped to meet the lower end of the market study rates, which was $4,000, does that pose an issue for government being able to pay rent?
I'm sorry, you asking me the question?
Sure, yeah. If these lease fees were raised to $4,000 a year, would that be an issue for ODOT?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Trying to think of if either of the tribe representatives want to weigh in on this. Because that would be a category they would fit into as well.
I think your comment's on the wrong line there, isn't it, Sheena?
You are very correct. Fine, I'll delete it.
Cassie or Lori, do you have a comment on proposing $4,000 a year for government?
No. Sorry, this is Cassie. No.
Okay.
Stephanie's asking us to wait. Oh, it was part of a continuation of a chat comment. Okay, we're good
Okay.
with you, Stephanie, sorry.
If you're not hearing issues,
Oh, I still raised mine. I just raised it earlier. I didn't think it needed to be repeated. I think 2,000 is fine for government, and I think you can justify it on under your rate, because I think your rate analysis. I think your rate analysis has some factors in there that have your numbers higher than they otherwise would be. So I'll register that.
okay, thank you. And we'll definitely
It'll be taken under advisement. Yes, I understand how that works.
It'll be part of the record. Thank you.
Does that summarize your comment, John?
Yes.
Oh, boy.
Perfect.
Just want to make sure I'm catching stuff here.
Well, we've
Speak-
got, don't forget, we've got Aaron taking notes for us. So
And thank goodness for that.
yeah, I
Speaking
wouldn't worry
of-
too much about making notes in the document.
Yeah. Speaking of for the record, I wanted to interject. I should have done this at the beginning of the meeting, but we didn't all come on at once. That the meeting is being recorded, just a reminder. So that helps us with notes at the end of the meeting as well. But there hasn't been anything inappropriate or anything. I'm not bringing it up because of that. I just wanted to remind people that this is a recorded meeting.
Awesome. So nonprofit, non-commercial, we're good with that, guys?
So this would be
3,000.
OPB, Harney Electric.
And reminder that this is where the base rate starts,
Yeah.
and
And this
there's
isn't a change from the current rate. This is one of the ones that actually stayed where we have them currently. Stephanie, do you have feedback on? Yes. So the old rates are much less. So Stephanie's saying we had an increase from 1,900 and are now paying 3,000. So was that increase found to be unreasonable by Harney Electric? Did that cause stress to the co-op or the users? No one liked it. Yeah, no one likes rate increases.
Hey, Amber, can you do me a favor and read chats out loud? Because I can't see them because I'm sharing screen.
Yeah, so
Thanks.
Stephanie's response to my question is, well, no one liked it. Is that, I would like to ask for, some details on the reasoning. Is that because costs are passed back to the customers? The more evidence we have, the more we can do.
While she's mulling over your question, Aaron, I hadn't thought about the previous chats. Are you able to track those while you're doing notes too, or does the new practice of Amber or I reading them out, is that going to help you?
Yeah, the reading them out helps for sure.
Okay. Oh, so give Stephanie a moment. She's working on her mute button.
Can you hear me?
Barely.
Maybe I'll just try to type in.
It's making all kinds of feedback. We're fine with the chat messages. We can do that. We just. I'll keep my eye on the chat and I'll holler if a new one pops up.
Thank you, Chris. We can keep going into commercial uses.
Oh.
Cassie, thank you for participating. She's having to bail out. As a reminder, she had another meeting to go to. We will definitely send you materials. We thank you for attending today.
Thanks, Cassie. Did we have any more comments from Stephanie or?
So Stephanie says it's a small piece of land and our GM doesn't think with all the different uses of the land that the total rents are at market value. His concern is that it will continue to grow unchecked. And John Biles says I'll also register support for the no one liked it comment. OPB wasn't keen on the rate increase either.
Both good comments.
Okay, and so Stephanie, I just want to clarify. So with all the different uses of the land, total rents the total rents are at market value. Is that the rent that was previously being paid or the rent currently?
While she's typing, I'm gonna ask too, Stephanie, if are you referring to situations where more than one lessee is paying on a piece of land, how that would affect market value?
All right, direct quotes here with the cellular rents, us being Harney Electric, and all our co-locations on Burns Butte, he thinks DSL is making out like bandits on a small piece of land. So she's speaking about the total rent being received at the lease site. So Harney County included in the total value that DSL is making on one lease location. All right. I do have to say that we didn't tally the totals based on the lease locations. We really only looked at the different uses and tailored the rent towards the use. So the total rent being received at the site wasn't a consideration in the study. And I believe that earlier in the rules, we went over that each individual use is separate and discrete and requires its own lease. Stephanie's further comment, his argument that a piece of property in downtown Burns would have a hard time recovering that type of rent annually.
I think it's a good comment worth noting. I just think that the counter argument would be then that would encourage all lessees in the state to want to go to one site in hopes of getting a prorated lease amount. And yeah, it's just an interesting concept. It's worth noting for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. With all that input received, I think we're ready to move on to commercial.
And just letting everybody know we're 30 minutes away from a break. So hopefully you can hang in there. Feels like we're doing fine.
So commercial, we tried to break this out kind of based on a business size by service area, as we kind of discussed in the definitions earlier. So are there any comments about this price structure here?
And commercial does not include cellular, so that will be a separate topic. What I guess I want to point out too is that we don't have very many leases that fit these categories. We do want to make sure that we accommodate if we get, you know, like a local radio station versus an internet company that covers Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Nevada. So we would think that there would be a difference in those types of uses. But we do want to make sure that our rates aren't exclusionary to the point where we don't have lessees anymore based on the rates that we set. Do we need to revisit the definition of these at all?
I'm not seeing any hands up on the Amber, but just wanted to share a comment of John's. He put in the chat box, he does not know where all the DSL sites are, but there's a built-in assumption that all the sites are of equal value and should bring in equal revenue. That assumption may or may not be correct.
I would say that all of the current communication sites are equally rural. The majority of them are in Harney County. And then we have a couple in forest land. But they are not near urban areas. They're well into the forest outside of urban areas. Yeah. And just as a reminder, so we define local commercial as for-profit entity with business dealings that provides commercial products or services to an area that does not extend beyond the boundaries of the state of Oregon. Regional is commercial products or services that extends beyond the state of Oregon, but not beyond Washington, Idaho, Nevada, and California. And then national would be beyond those states that border Oregon. So it's kind of based on how big of an area the company has business dealings in. Okay, so not seeing any questions. Let's jump into cellular. Well, I guess we do have Lumen on here. So that would definitely be commercial and probably in the regional category. Travis, do you have any insight on what types of rent Lumen or CenturyLink pays at a typical site?
Actually, I don't have that information.
Okay.
And then we received comments from John, and I assume Stephanie didn't say it though, about OPBs and HEC's lease increases last time. Percentage, 250% and 151%.
So Sheena, do you know the last time that the rent rates were established? Because they were really very low. Because we adjusted them to the current rates in 2017.
Prior to that, with the special use, the last time the special use rules were opened, I want to say it was in like the 2006-07 range.
So rent
Maybe even earlier than that.
Rent hadn't been increased in about a decade.
It's been a long time since they were open. They were opened briefly. I know briefly in the late like 2006, 7, 8 timeframe, but I think it was a very small opening for a very specific reason. I'm not sure when the last ComSci rules were done. I can maybe try to look that up really quick.
That's okay. I just wanted to comment on the increase in rent and just that those rates hadn't gone up in a decade or more.
We can keep forging ahead. I may actually have that at my fingertips, so I'll look for you keep navigating the document.
Would you look? I can't seem to get Zoom things out of the way enough to see something.
Yeah, the previous rate was 1,800.
The previous base rate was actually 1,200 with increasers. And I don't remember when that was established. I know I wasn't involved, so.
All right, Chip, you're on the hook. Cellular rent.
Well, yeah, and look at this. I think John has touched on it a little bit earlier, but in terms of the rent for the cellular side of my world, is that it's all based on pricing matrices for each carrier. That it's determined by urban versus rural, How much on a raw land space, which is a new site? What's the size of the lease area? Is it 50 by 30, 50 by 50?
Chip, you're really breaking up.
So it just kind of, uh-oh.
We didn't
I
catch
may
like
have
the
to
last
circle
minute.
back with you if that's the case. Oh.
We can
you
hear
me
you now. Yeah.
Okay. So because of the pricing matrices within carriers, what they're used to is that pricing is difference between urban and rural is fairly significant. And also according to the ground space that they're taking up in terms of, is it a lease area that's 20 by 20, 30 by 30, 50 by 50 or bigger. So it just to a degree feels like it's kind of a blanket pricing overall without taking into consideration the variables involved in that traditionally we've looked at in the matrix of pricing. As for example, the site we're working on Highway 78 near Foley Farm Road is extremely rural, but there's that compared to a site out of Portland would be, or somewhere in Portland Metro, the broadline site is completely different. And so, yeah, it just feels like it's got a big blanket statement to it in terms of pricing. I don't know if there's a end around that or taking into consideration the complexities.
If we were to continue to consider it as a blanket rate, knowing that most of our sites are very rural, does this rate seem to fit what you would pay for a rural site, or is it totally out of whack?
No, it's actually a little high for rural. I mean, the farther you go out, the less the monthly rent is or the yearly, payment. Your annual escalation is not off track. I know for all carriers, they've all in the last 5-8 years have pushed back on 3%, 4%, but 3% is not out of whack, in my opinion. But just depending on location, yeah, 20 a year could be on the higher end, given again the particular location it would be at.
Okay, so if you were to devise a way to be more specific in the rent, you would take into account square footage, location.
Yep, rural versus urban.
And then you also mentioned bare land versus not.
Yeah, would it be yeah, right. A raw land, we call raw land was building new from scratch a tower versus structure.
You cut out there again at the end.
Sorry about that. Yeah, the difference being a raw land site, which is a new tower in a new location versus possibly co-locating on an existing structure. There's also differences in pricing there.
Do you have any approximate figures?
No, it's tough to figure out. All the carriers have a different matrix. They're all very similar, close to in some degree as each other. I don't know if that's by plan or what, but they usually don't release that until they pass along leases to me for certain specific areas, as I am a liaison between them and the property owner as far as going through and handling the lease. So, if I look at it, saying it's 20,000 a year in rural, which is what, 1,600 plus per month. Yeah, that would be high. I mean, a lot of those situations in a rural setting, I mean, I've seen them go for 1,000. I've seen them go for less, depending on certain variables. I've seen them go for a little bit more, but that seems to be more rare. And again, it all comes down to geographically, where is it located?
Okay, so I think you guys are aware, we're definitely taking notes. All of these comments are going to be considered when we regroup after this meeting and take a look at what's been proposed. I will say we've prefer to establish rates rather than to do something complicated like make an equation. Some of this rates that we did see, especially through the BLM, had like 12 different categories, and then they did it by population, and it was really quite complicated. So when we drafted these rules, we were attempting to be more simple, more straightforward, and the hope was to be reasonable. So we'll definitely ponder that as we take another look at these. We've got some comments. So John has pointed out that the previous rent, which was at 1,200, would have taken 30 years to hit $3,000 if it had a 3% increaser. Chris noted from DSL that the special use rules, which accommodate communication sites, were opened in 2008, and then again briefly in 2015 and 2017, but that was specifically to address geothermal energy. And John gave a breakdown of the increase in rent over time if you started at 1,200, and how long it would take to hit 3,000. Stephanie says John and my boss would get along pretty well. Okay. So I guess the question when we think about that analysis is, was 1,200 truly the market value? Was DSL meeting their fiduciary responsibility to the Common School Fund at that rent rate? And I will point out that that rent rate was blanket across the board. It applied to every use. It didn't differentiate between commercial or government or cellular. So to use Stephanie's words, there were some lessees that were making out like bandits. And then I guess I do want to point out too that we went through a very similar rate study to adjust the rents in 2017, because it was determined that the $1,200 wasn't market value, and that we didn't think we were meeting our Common School Fund obligations.
Does anybody have any more comments about these compensation numbers? John, the 2017 rate for nonprofit was $3,000.
Yeah, so the 2017 was just 3 categories: non-commercial, commercial, and cellular. And then I guess I have a request for Travis. If you could get maybe some feedback to us about the commercial rent rates that an internet provider would expect to pay at a site. And I guess keeping in mind that most of our sites are rural, just to see kind of what that would look like from a company that operates in Oregon.
Yeah, well, absolutely, I will.
Thank you. Okay, let's move forward.
Minutes till break. We're doing good.
Okay, so we kind of went through these two, and I changed the numbering just to keep up with this 3 we added. So that puts us on number 4, which concerns the 3% annual increase commencing in the 2nd year and compounding annually thereafter for the term of the lease. Anyone with comments on that one? I saw in the chat that 3% may be too much, and then we heard some conversation from Chip that 3% is normal. 3% is kind of typical CPI from Consumer Price Index from past years when we've checked that.
Stephanie has a comment, says this is what BLM does on our sites with them. To clarify, the 3% increaser is what you're speaking about? 3%.
3% is normal. Okay.
Okay, yeah, and Lori echoes 3% is normal. Yes, for nonprofit also. Great. Okay, so that's good to hear.
So number 5 talks about lease renewals, and this is where we don't start over. This is where when you have a lease, you have a renewal term in the lease, your rent just picks up where it left off. So that one was kind of hard to communicate, we felt, so, as far as wordsmithing it. So does that make sense? This term that I've got highlighted, which would be number 5 now, new number 5. I got a thumbs up from John, I saw.
Okay, so that would continue the annual 3% increase unless we went through another market study, which would result in updating the rates.
Yeah, so that's this new number 6, where we want to be able to reevaluate from time to time. That doesn't necessarily mean there would be changes, but we should be checking every now and again. And honestly, since you guys saw the rate tables and you saw how much work it is, not something that we necessarily want to do just willy-nilly. It's a huge workload.
This is Chip. Will there be anything in what is now 6, as opposed to periodically, but some specific time frame for evaluation? Like every 5 years or 4 years.
We thought about that, but then we'd be stuck to it. So, you know, we're looking long-term here. We want to get at least 1 lease term out of this set of rules, if not 2. So that's 10 to 20 years.
Usually every 10 years is about where we want to be doing a market rate study. And sometimes we may embark on one and not say, oh, okay, it looks like our rates are still on par, you know, with the rest of the Western states. And so it may result in no changes.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right.
I think I'm missing it. It must be here somewhere, but isn't the intent that the, I'll use the non-commercial because that's the one that's on my brain. The 3,000 starts when the rules are effective, and then it increases by 3% every year thereafter?
Yeah, that would be assuming that a lease renewed in the same year that these became effective. So we're going to honor current lease rates until the leases expire.
Right. So if we are doing a renewal in, say, 5 years from now, then it's going to be 3,000 times 1.03 times 1.03 times 1. It's going to compound for 5 years, right? You're not going to start at 3,000 when on that renewal, are you?
It would start at 3,000. So no, we're not going to say starting today, we're compounding our numbers. No. So if we got a new application 4 years from now, and they fit the category that started at $3,000, their lease rent would start at $3,000.
So here's the rent structure tables, John. So for non-commercial nonprofit, where the first year's lease year starts at 3,000, it's a $90 increase with the 3% every year. And then lease year 2 is 3,090 because you take this 90 and add it to that. And it just kind of keeps compounding until you get to this 3,900.
So I think what John is saying though is if we wait 5 years for a renewal and we start them off at 3,000, is that the market rate for 5 years from now?
So OPB's lease renews in 24. Does that mean we're going to be paying for 23? We're going to be paying 3,000 and, well, it's in my chart there, right? Oh no, I didn't go out that far. I did on my Excel. 1, 2. We're going to be paying almost $3,300. Does that mean in year 2024 with the renewal application, we're going to pay 3,000?
Yes. And then
actually, no.
I'm happy with that, but that's screwy.
Actually, no, because of this. Well, no, because it would be a new lease at that point. Is there a renewal term in that lease? John?
There is
Well,
a renewal term.
That's what I'm saying
Yeah.
is to be treating new leases and renewal terms differently at different amounts seems screwy to me. Because,
Okay, so we
right?
need some clarifying language then here. So the way we've treated them currently is that basically it starts over. So you would start over at 3,000. I understand what you're saying though. If these rules go into effect, then it would seem like number 5 would apply to a renewal where the 3% would just, you would go on to the next lease rate.
probably just cost Chip a lot of money. Sorry, Chip.
Ouch. Thanks, John.
Okay. That's some good clarification. It does read the way that John is pointing out. So that would change the way I did the tables then. That could change the numbers, and those changes would really result in increases on the numbers that you've already seen. So
Yeah, that's going to change your entire spreadsheet. It's going to change the way that you have to write your section 2 under this compensation reg significantly, right?
you have to go back up to section 2.
Well, where you set the minimum, or you have to. Beginning on the effective date of this regulation, the amounts in section 2 will be increased by 3% for each subsequent year. Something like that has to be added there to cure
Yeah.
the screwiness. Otherwise, I'm not going to renew. I'm going to cancel and do a new lease.
Noted. Okay.
So you think that language should go under section 2? This,
Well, I would probably put it as flush language to section 2 at the very bottom of your A, B, and C. So it would go. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I was looking at mine. Yeah, it would go there. It'd go flush language.
as a little d or as a number 3?
Let's see. No, it would go D. It'd be D. Because it refers to the section above.
All right, so
The amounts in sections A, B, and C will be adjusted, will be increased by 3% for every year subsequent to the effective date of this regulation, or something to that effect. I'm sure your lawyers have done that thousands of times, so.
Yeah, and these have not been sent to our council yet. So I think we might have to think on this one.
And so now that you're recouping revenue there, maybe that gives you more freedom to discuss where you start with your initial rates across the board. Because your financial model has now been kind of upended, right?
At this point, yes.
See, Chip, I take and I give.
Yeah, I think you're awesome. You're still good in my books. Now, please remind me, Amber, on the initial term and renewal terms. What are the length of time periods in there? Is it 10 years for the initial?
So 10 years is the maximum lease term.
Okay.
And then I'd have to look at what we put in the renewal section. Give me just a moment.
Sure.
Modifications. Okay, so renewals doesn't have its own section. It is that's probably in the next section in general terms and conditions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just as an example, within the wireless industry as a standard, they normally, and most carriers do, they go with a 5-year initial term and 4 additional 5-year renewal terms, which could be automatic, but aren't necessarily always automatic. And the 3% annual increase or X percentage of increase, yes, correct, is after that first year, starts then and goes for every year thereafter for the life of the lease, which at least in the wireless industry is 25 years.
Okay, so 5-year initial term, 4
Additional
additional 5-year terms,
renewal terms.
renewal.
Mhm.
Okay, this might be a little bit out of order. So how does that affect like bonding? If I guess the bond would just remain in place if you renewed it.
Mhm.
So, and then you said the 3% continues to increase annually throughout the 25 years.
Mhm.
Okay, so in the very next section, the term of a lease may be up to but not exceeding 10 years unless otherwise approved by the director. That's a blanket statement that's in all of our rules. The director has the ultimate authority. The department will determine the length of a lease and any renewal provisions based on the nature of the use intended for the requested site. So I think that gives us flexibility, Chip, if they prefer 5-year increments. I think that we have the flexibility to do that. It just says that our maximum term will not exceed 10 years.
Okay.
But we could write in, you know, another lease term of 10 years as a renewal.
I can tell you from negotiations that trying to get a term longer than, well, what I got was 5 and 10 was exceptionally difficult. And even getting that was difficult. From my perspective and almost all of the other leases I negotiate, and it's far more than I'd like to, we're looking to extend that at least to 20, 25 years as well. And I want to negotiate leases so that by the time it comes around again, I'm retired. I don't have to negotiate it again.
That's how we want to
We-
do the rules.
Yes, we hear that. So the reason for the short lease terms recently was because we've been waiting in the wings to try to get these rules done. And that's why there's been 5-year lease terms lately. We were trying to kind of time it so that lease renewals would come up very soon after these new rules are adopted.
So, but what I heard from Amber is that the total term, renewal and regular term, couldn't, under this language, couldn't exceed 10 years. Did
The
I
initial-
hear that
yeah.
right?
The initial term and
But you could
And
have
we
a
would have-
10-year renewal, so
and
that
you can have a
would total
10-year renewal
20.
in it. Mhm.
So that wouldn't quite meet
Okay.
Chip's 25, but that would total 20 if you had one renewal.
But you could do 3 5s after the 10, right?
Yeah.
Correct.
And they could be essentially as automatic as your current renewal language.
Yeah, but that does, if you do those shorter renewal terms, that means you're paying renewal fees. Even though they're smaller, that's still, you got to go through the application and fee paying process.
Right.
So-
You could do a 10-year term, a 10-year renewal, and a 5-year renewal. Again,
Yes.
math's not my strength, but I think that's 25.
Yep, and it's not out of the question too to have a 30-year lease or more.
Yeah,
It's been done.
yep. It's just that the maximum term
Initial is 10.
initial is 10. Yeah.
Okay, so then we could have 2 additional 10-year renewal terms for a total of 30. And then some language after that that it could continue forward with agreement from all parties.
Yeah, and that could be negotiated lease language.
Sure.
Okay, so
I'm going to intercede there real quick, Amber, because we promised everybody a break.
yeah, I was gonna suggest that maybe we finish our section unless we're done. I think we're done. All we have is that number 6 about, or number 7 about ORS 758010, which is something we have no control over. And then,
We can take a break and come back to this one real quick.
Sounds like Sheena needs a break too. Yeah, that was my way of saying I need a break.
All right,
So-
folks.
let's take a break. Let's take 10 minutes. Before we all go, John, in your last chat message, you'd said something about comments coming. Did you mean coming up in the chat, or did you'll send some later?
No, I meant the 10-year term that I've already spoken a piece on.
Oh, okay, perfecto. Then let's take a 10-minute breaks in honor of the concept of 10-year terms. So be back at 3:45. Thank you.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Well, my computer shows 3:45, so hopefully everybody's back. Let's roll our sleeves up again and dive in.
So the last part in this section is the new number 7, which is the ORS 578-010 blanket statement. Anybody, any comments on that?
I don't know what it means. Can you, I've looked at the statute. Can you tell me what it means?
Amber, you're muted.
Thanks. This is a really old statute, and basically our understanding of the intent of the statute is that it applies to linear features such as power lines or telephone lines that are, you know, linearly running across land. It doesn't speak necessarily to like cellular communications or sites that are you know, just in one place that don't extend in a linear fashion.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it harks back to the electrification of Oregon, and everybody here can tell you I love saying electrification of Oregon because then I do my air quotes. But yeah, according to it, we consulted with DOJ on this and reinterpreting this for us, and they said it, you know, it was originally intent to prevent utility companies from having to pay outrageous easement fees to run lines that were benefiting communities, that type of thing.
Yeah, and I will say that so it just pertains to easements. It doesn't pertain to leases necessarily. So if you know, Harney Electric had a power line that was running across our 80-acre parcel that is Burns Butte, then that easement wouldn't necessarily require compensation. But it is specific to easements.
I guess it doesn't hurt anything, but it seems out of place. If it's specific to easements and has nothing to do with communication site leases, then why is it in the compensation section for communication site leases? I'm not a hill I'm gonna die on, but seems weird.
Yeah, this is a remnant from the last set of rules, so it's just something that we have to honor.
It's an obligatory, we have to have this in here. And it actually does fit under compensation. Because it basically says like, it has to do with compensation fees. And how much those are paid for, how much utility companies have to pay for those across state land. Does that make sense?
Again,
Stephanie
not a
has-
hill. We can move on as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. Stephanie, what are RUS borrowers? What is that? I don't understand your comment. Says her comment is specifically for RUS borrowers. I don't think all utilities. Rural co-ops that have debt. Okay. Okay. The follow-up, she says like rural co-ops that have debt with the government, not PG&E. Got it. I'm tracking. All right, general terms and conditions. So to make number one more clear on the term situation, if I put in here the initial term of a lease, maybe up to, but not exceeding 10 years, and then the renewals are kind of open-ended. Does that soothe some heartburn with lease terms?
I think that's reasonable.
Okay. Number two, leases will be offered by the department for the minimum area determined by the department to be required for the requested use. Any heartburn there? We don't want to tie up land unnecessarily, basically.
Mhm.
Number three basically says, this is also holdover and also ubiquitous across all of our administrative rules, that the lease will be issued on a form, basically on a lease template that we supply that's been approved for legal sufficiency by the Department of Justice. So there's not much we can do with that one. Number four. So this one, we want to be able to close off the area to public access to protect equipment, property, that kind of thing. We actually have to go through a rulemaking process to do a closure like this. And this would not lock out authorized lessees. So this is basically just to keep public out from recreation. And this would happen if we have documented incidences of vandalism or theft or some sort of property destruction.
And then I'll, just as a reference, like the grazing rules would say that these lands are open for multiple uses. So typically our rules say that these lands are open for multiple uses. But communication sites are kind of a special case due to the high value of the equipment that's on site.
High value of the equipment, and also like the propane tanks and the solar panels and potentially hazardous materials and batteries and whatnot that are up on these sites.
Yeah, and then
We wanna
obviously not losing emergency services.
Yeah. So I assume no one's gonna have any problems with that. Not seeing any comments in the chat. We have the right to enter onto and upon the authorized area at any time. So this means we go up there to do our management inspections, make sure there isn't unauthorized uses and that kind of thing. That's pretty standard language as well. This is that the lease is your reservation to guarantee access. And actually there's more access stuff coming, John. So John says there is no reservation to guarantee access here to leaseholders. So this number 4 is restricting public entry or recreational use by the public. And that was on number 4. So this one basically says number 6 is kind of another access issue. Unless otherwise agreed to in writing as a provision of the authorization, the holder of a communication site facilities lease may not interfere with lawful public use of an authorized area or state lands adjacent to an authorized area or obstruct free transit across state land. At no time may the holder or their representatives intimidate or otherwise threaten or harm public usage of state land. This one is kind of as a result of some lessees trying to lock out public users in certain situations. So this is another one that's going to be ubiquitous across all of our administrative rules. Does anybody have any comments here? Okay, not seeing any. Number 7, holder of a communications lease must dispose of all waste in a proper manner, must not permit debris, garbage, or other refuge to either accumulate within the authorized area or to be discharged onto state lands or waterways adjacent to authorized area. This is also a term that's covered in your lease. Actually, several of these general terms and conditions are also stated in the lease specifically. So number 8, stop. We have all these terms. Holder of a communication site facility lease must cooperate and comply with appropriate county agencies for detection, prevention, control of noxious weeds. ODA has the right to enter our lands to conduct abatement or surveys for noxious weeds or other invasive species. So the holder of a communication site facility lease must conduct all operations within the authorized area in a manner that conserves fish and wildlife habitat, protects water quality, does not contribute to insect or animal infestation, soil erosion, or the growth of noxious plants. So basically, if you guys see some issue on the land, let us know. So we can work on that together, get it fixed. Unless otherwise agrees to in writing, the holder of a communication site facility lease must remove any or all developments as directed by the department within 180 calendar days of the date of expiration or termination of the authorization. If the holder of the communication site facility lease refuses to remove subsequent subject developments, the department may remove them and charge the holder for doing so. So in the event of expiration or termination, expiration and no renewal, so full termination for whatever reason, there's 180 days to remove all the equipment.
Stephanie asked equipment or structure. That would include structures. So any or all developments would include both equipment and structures. There's also the case, and I think we'll get into this later, that basically if it's vacated, the department could potentially take ownership of, say, a building that was left or a tower that was left. But I think we address that later on.
The holder of a communication site facilities lease will not allow any other use to be made of or occur on the site or facility that is not specifically authorized by the lease or by the department in writing prior to the use, including allowing co-location of all or a portion of a lease area or structures therein. So this basically says no co-location, subleasing.
Additional
With
equipment that isn't
additional equipment.
authorized.
Needs to be authorized by the lease. Holders of a communication site facility lease must be the entity which owns the equipment and structures installed on state land under the lease. So facility managers, random third parties managing a site on somebody else's behalf cannot be a leaseholder.
Arguably, that language is broad enough to include purchase money security interests. It's not an issue for me, but I would imagine that for some of your prospective tenants, if they're financing their facilities, it could be.
Can you propose some language here to fix that? We actually do things like that under a consent agreement, though. So we actually have consent agreements for different types of leases for when there is a bank involved or a loan involved. We do it for ag leases all the time.
This is even lower than the last hill for me. I just thought I'd point it out.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. Thank you for pointing that out, though. I actually didn't think about that. So here's some stuff for facility managers in the event where there's facility managers or contractors. The holder of a communication site facility lease employing contractors or facility managers for the purposes of site management as the holder's representatives are required to provide written verification, providing permission and designating a facility manager, site manager, contractor, or subcontractor employed by the holder to communicate with the department regarding management of the communication site facility lease, and a single point of contact for all communication between the department and the leaseholder's facility manager concerning the lease administration. So this is actually more of a, having facility managers and contractors is more of a thing for the larger cell tower sites. So Chip, do you have any comments here?
No, it's fine. I
Okay.
think it's written fine.
This helps us only have one person to talk to. It doesn't become such a mess.
Right. Common for me being a vendor to all the carriers. I often end up that point of contact.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Chip, maybe you could help enlighten us a little bit. So there's one particular lessee that they'll use one contractor for a lease modification, and then they'll come back a year later and have a different contractor and they'll want to do something else to the lease. Is that common, or maybe that's just an issue we have with one particular lessee?
Or that's probably more likely that one leasee. Yes, at least on the leasing side of or the management of a lease, yeah, they could switch vendors, right? One vendor could be on the out, one could be on the in. You just want some formal notification that, whatever you require, in writing, that there's a new vendor taking over representation of that lease on their behalf.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because we tend to get contacted by a lot of different people, and they're not the people that are on the lease, and then they say that they're representing the lessee's interest, and we don't have any way to prove that necessarily. So we kind of want to straighten that stuff out.
Yep, that would definitely be a document that specifies specifically who that vendor is that's handling the lease. I mean, like in the beginning too, there could be situations where, a general contractor is going in to do the initial build, or a general contractor that's going to do modifications, right, to the equipment on the tower. But either way, you still want one, for like a better example, lease administrator that represents
Yes.
the leasee. And
Yes.
if they want to change, awesome. Just clarify who that is, and make sure that that's in your records so everybody knows who's that one person to contact.
Okay.
Perfect.
That was what we were hoping to communicate here. Okay, moving on to 14. The holder of a communication site facility authorizations must maintain all buildings, equipment, similar structures or improvements located within the authorized area in a good state of repair as determined by the department. So no falling down buildings or towers that could cause a hazard. 15, all buildings, structures, towers, and equipment such as generators are required to be labeled by the lessee indicating the authorization number. This actually, we need to know what equipment goes with what, because if anybody's ever been to any of these sites, they can be kind of a mess, and following the wires doesn't seem to work. So
And the numbers seem like a discreet way to do it without advertising whose equipment, so it doesn't become a target too.
Yes.
yeah. Is there any input from on any of our lessees on that one? Stephanie,
Labeling equipment
John,
with lease
Gabe?
numbers.
I don't see
Stephanie,
that that's a requirement in the lease. Is it going to be in your new form?
This
Yes.
is, yes. Help us figure out what belongs to who, and by using the numbers, it keeps it more anonymous.
So yeah, this is Gabe. The majority of our stuff, I think, has ODOT stickers on it, especially if it crosses specific dollar thresholds. But yeah, I don't see putting more stickers on them would be fine with us.
Okay. Moving on to number 16, equipment modifications resulting in a change of frequency are subject to a public review period where other authorized users of a site will be notified to identify any potential frequency conflicts. If a frequency conflict is identified, the holder proposing the frequency change will work to resolve the frequency issue so as to not interfere with other holders' uses. I'm going to get rid of public there because it's really just aimed at other lessees on the site. But John, this
Oh.
is for you, by the way.
Can we go back a step? Stephanie commented that it would be a challenge to label Harney Electric's equipment. Stephanie, I just want to confirm that's what your comment's relating to. That's going to be a challenge. Well, so Stephanie says all our co-locators too, would we be in charge in that? We'd be in charge of that, question mark.
We mostly had in mind, yeah, like a sticker on the door of your building is perfect. And like this tower belongs to Harney Electric, that kind of thing. Very simple.
Well,
Yeah.
and it doesn't have to be the name necessarily. That's why we were thinking lease number, because like Chris pointed out, we don't want specific entities becoming targets for any reason, especially when we have emergency services on site. Stephanie
So-
says, great, thanks.
Does that sound, is that not as big of a challenge as you thought, Stephanie? Okay, good.
On 16,
Mm-hmm.
you have users plural, but then you have holders singular possessive.
Oh, dang it.
Other than that, I'm pretty sure that language I've seen somewhere.
In the lease, probably. And the leases are written based off of these rules, so.
Does that fix it?
Well, that's possessive too then there.
No, undo that change and then go to your last sentence where it says other holders and
Mhm.
swap the S and the apostrophe, and then you'll be better.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
You've
Okay.
still got your apostrophe in there.
I see that.
And you have an extra space where you, up there in front of that you put in, there you go.
Okay. So any other comments on 16? That's clear. John's shaking his head no, so okay, we'll move on. 17, all these. If requested by the department, a holder of a communication site facility lease must present evidence to the department prior to the use that they have obtained all permits and approval required by local, state, federal governing bodies to undertake the proposed use, and any permit or approval that may be required to obtain access to, or to cross land belonging to a person other than the department to undertake the use. That means if you need to go through private land to get to the state land, you've got an easement. A surety bond, certificate of deposit, or other financial instrument and insurance as required by the department pursuant to section 200 further down in the document, where we have a whole section devoted to insurance and bonds.
You can strike the and after 17A.
What about this and? Can I keep it? Oh, I can keep that one. Okay. 18. Communication site facility lease allows the holder the authorization to access their lease area through state lands adjacent to the authorized area.
So
Yeah.
using Burns Butte as an example, the state owns 80 acres at Burns Butte. You have to drive up a big hill to get to the site. We're not going to require you to establish an easement across the rest of the state land to access the site. The access is implied through the rules and through the lease.
19, the holder of a ComSite lease will indemnify the state of Oregon and the Department of State Lands against any claim or cost arising from or related to a release of hazardous substance on or from the authorized area. That's another standard one across our administrative rules. So is there anything under, any further comments on the general terms and conditions, or can we move forward?
No hands are up, Sheena.
All right. All right, co-location.
So, so I was going to prepare a diagram to kind of give an example about the issues that we have currently, and that didn't happen today, but I could pull up a map of Burns Butte and pick on ODOT and OPB and just kind of talk through it. So hang on, figure out how to share screen.
I can stop sharing.
Yeah. Yeah, so we just kind of want to discuss what our structure is now and then kind of our ideas of how we want it to work. So Burns Butte is a big tangled mess, as most of you know. These 3 red squares, sorry about the bright red, is kind of a lease triangle where we have one building, which is owned by ODOT, and then we have 2 towers, one owned by OPB and one owned by Pacificor. So in the current scenario, when we have what we're now calling co-locators, what we used to call sublessees, each of these 3 entities have their own lease, but ODOT owns the building and they're on OPB's tower, or Pacificor's tower, excuse me. So under Pacificor's lease, ODOT would be a sublessee. And then under ODOT's lease, Pacificor would be a sublessee, and OPB would also be a sublessee because they access ODOT's building. So we end up with this big mess of ODOT has 2 sublessees, Pacificor has a sublessee, and we end up with 5 different documents to talk about the same area that's being used in conjunction with each other. So what we would propose to do, rather than have this person have a sublessee here and this person have a sublessee there, is everybody has their own lease. And in this scenario, the base leases would basically cover everything. So there wouldn't be a need for ODOT to have a consent to sublease for Pacificor. It would be noted and covered in their base lease. And then when we would have like an additional co-locator that would come on. So let's just pretend ODOT owns both the building and the tower. And then a radio station wants to jump on their tower. So the radio station doesn't have to go through, well, it does go through the consent to sublease process, but that station would have their own lease at a modified rate. So it would be a co-locator lease with the department. So instead of doing this back and forth, we authorize you, you authorize us. We just want to make it straightforward, have each entity that owns equipment or owns a structure is required to have a lease. And then additional co-locators that don't own the tower or don't own the building would fall under a co-locator lease. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I'm following that, but
Yeah,
I think that's a function of that arrangement more than anything else. But, and I'm looking back at our stuff with state of Oregon and with ODOT, and it was like 1985, and we've been continually using that same co-facilities sharing agreement. So yeah, I'm not sure I can tell you if that makes sense or not, the way you want to change it.
So basically it would be, there should be a consent to sublease on file for ODOT giving OPB permission to use the building. And then OPB should also have a consent to sublease for ODOT giving permission to use OPB's tower. So it's like this back and forth where each entity has to go through the documentation process, which also requires the department to go through the documentation process. So now we have 2 consent to subleases on top of the 2 leases that are in place, rather than each entity just having a base lease. So I know it's complicated because it's complicated, but what we're proposing is we're hoping going to simplify the amount of paperwork that the lessees have to do, the co-locators have to do, and that the department has to do.
and it would reduce the fees. So the consent to sublease has the $250 application fee, and that essentially goes away. There's just a lease fee, just the lease application fee and the compensation rate for the co-location. So because right now, the way our current sublease structure works, we have to bill in arrears for each sublease, and each lessee has to report that to us so that we can generate an invoice and send it out. And that's a huge workload for us to track. And it just gets really messy, especially when there's multiple consent to sublease forms for one lessee. And this would just clarify that, you know, OPB has this base lease. They also have equipment in ODOT's tower. It's all set in the lease, and they just pay the normal lease fee every year. And we don't have to worry about back and forth with billings, billing in arrears at the end of the lease year, that kind of thing. So we're really hoping this proposed co-location structure just streamlines everything, and details about where everybody's equipment is located is actually in the lease.
Okay, let's look at the rules and see if those make more sense.
Working on it. Here they come. Okay. So number 1, a lessee wanting to co-locate with a separate entity on a portion of an existing communication site facility is required to notify the department in writing at least 90 calendar days prior to the date they propose allowing the co-locator access to the site for placing or installing equipment. So 90 days before, we need an application. All entities using a communication site facility are required to obtain an authorization from the department corresponding with the following. A, the owners of the structures are required to obtain a base lease per 130 and 140 above, which is what we went over in the last meeting, the application requirements and how we process the applications, and are subject to the compensation fees per what we just talked about earlier. Owners of structures subject to base leases are not subject to additional co-locator fees. And then B, entities co-locating on existing leases that are not an owner of a structure or building are required to obtain a co-location lease. The entity requesting co-location on a portion of a communication site facility must apply to the department per 131, 90 calendar days. So this is the application again prior to installing any equipment and must remit to the department the non-refundable application fee as outlined in 170. The department will evaluate co-location applications received per 140, which is how we evaluate all applications. So we'd go through the whole frequency issues and things like that. Any questions on that?
That doesn't seem to be a big change.
Nope.
Thus far.
Thus far.
Okay. We'd still have to apply for the consent. Instead of doing it now, we're just applying for the co-location, right? Okay.
So here's the co-location fees. Here's the co-location application fees. And they are, what we do, half of the full base lease. So for a co-location lease, non-commercial would be 250, commercial would be 500, and cellular would be 1,000.
And this is with the understanding that these fees are typically passed off to the co-locator.
So yeah, the co-locator would be the applicant in this case. Any thoughts on those amounts?
They're waived if you have the base lease, right?
Well, the base lease has their own, so yeah.
Right.
This is,
Yeah,
this
the-
is
So
just
these
for the
only-
co-location.
So these don't imply in our triangle picture you put up there.
Not unless,
Not unless OPB has someone that doesn't already have a physical, if we rent space on our tower and
Yes.
and ODOT rents space in their building to someone who wants to do broadcast or whatever they want to do, then this applies.
so Stephanie has a question. Let's answer John's question first. So yes, this would apply. The co-locator would be basically applying for their own lease to use space on your tower.
Yep. And they would be the holder of that lease. We wouldn't have this go-between relationship, this parent-child relationship, like we do now with sublessees.
I
So.
don't understand that part.
Yeah, so I think that actually answers Stephanie's question as well, because she says HEC would no longer be charged for our co-locator sublease app fees. And yes, you are understanding that correctly. The co-locator would be
The applicant.
the applicant.
So Day Wireless wants space on OPB's tower and space in ODOT's building so that they can do their wireless services. They're going to have to apply for a lease
Mhm.
with the department,
Mhm.
and they're going to have to pay their application fee, and the lease is going to look presumably something close to what the lease looks like for someone who actually has a building on location, right?
Yes.
And that's going to result in less department work.
Believe it or not, yes. There's not as much back and forth on an annual basis and going through the parent-child lease situation.
So if you think about the ODOT, OPB, where ODOT has the building, OPB has the tower, and let's say a internet company comes in, wants on OPB's tower, which means they also have to use ODOT's building. They're just going to apply once for a co-locator lease rather than applying twice for consent to sublease to ODOT and a consent to sublease to OPB.
Okay, but unless the consent has changed a lot since 2019, it's a one-page form as opposed to a 15-page contract. What am I
That
missing?
is a good point. We need more information. So we need the same amount of information on the co-locator's equipment that we would have on a lessee's equipment. We want to know what the frequencies are. We want to know what's being installed, what type of antennas or drums or whatever they are. We want to know the use. We need information about the business. We need to, verify that it's a business in good standing that's registered to do business in the state of Oregon, all those types of things. So the current structure that we have with that one pager isn't really sufficient for us to actually know what's happening on the state land, essentially. So it does need to be more close to what the full lease process is. We need all the same information for a sublessee that we would for a base lessee. And that one-page application doesn't capture any of that stuff.
So I can understand that as a rationale.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then maybe this isn't extra work, but to kind of bill it as this is a more efficient process than what we're doing right now is really hard for me to understand.
Well, when we have, 22 lessees and some of them have 5 co-locators that use
Yep.
multiple pieces of equipment, it's been a really messy experience with the current structure.
Yeah, so maybe the efficiency isn't so much just what we just talked about, but also that sublessees or co-locators have gotten lost in the shuffle in the past and then run into where the base lessee is like, well, we didn't get our money from them, and so you're not getting our money. And or we didn't know that they still had something on our tower, and there's just kind of a whole tracking issue too. So it's more of an accountability of knowing who's really on our land at a time. Maybe efficiency was the wrong word to use, but it will help get
Helps our
more control
organization.
over this site. Yeah. There's
Stephanie,
been a lot of detective work behind the scenes of trying to track that stuff down, and that's where the efficiency comes in, is eliminating that and getting to answer Stephanie's question about HEC's role, getting the base lessee out of the enforcer role, and then they're just a landlord that's renting out some space in their building. That's their role. But we have the direct role. Maybe landlord was the wrong word to use because we still own the land, but there we go. She's nodding now. So I think we're good there.
Stephanie likes it. That's good news. So yeah, obviously we need written confirmation from the base lessee that these users are allowed on the equipment that you own or the structure that you own. But yes, the fees wouldn't go through Harney Electric. They would come straight from the co-locator to the department.
Okay, so everybody seems to be okay with the application fees being half of the full lease. The term for a co-location lease will be determined by the department and may be subject to termination or renewal that coinciding with the termination or renewal of the base lease the co-locator is occupying. So OPB, if your lease expires in 4 years, we wouldn't issue a co-locator lease for longer than that because it's kind of subject to that anyways.
That makes sense. I'm good with that.
Compensation. Here's all the compensation numbers for Amber.
Yeah, so hoping for some input on this. It wasn't very clear in the rate study what a good compensation rate would be for a co-locator. They were all across the board. Like we said before, some states appraise everything and some states have 16 different categories. And the rates that we've put in the draft rules here are basically 2/3 of what a lease rate would be. So I'm hoping to get some feedback on, the type of co-locators that anybody on this RAC might have, and whether or not requiring them to pay fees to the department in this amount messes up that relationship, and basically if it's reasonable and doable. So Stephanie's asking about some email conversation. She specifically asked about a co-locator such as a rancher that would be using ham radio for ranch communications. Would that fit under non-commercial or would it be commercial? And I think the definitions that we've outlined in the rules are that the use of the site, specifically the communication site on state land, whether or not the use of the site is for profit. Are you selling a service? Are you selling, cellular telephone services? Are you selling internet? Things like that, OPB is a not-for-profit, Harney Electric's not-for-profit, state, same thing. So I think that example would put a rancher under personal use, non-commercial in that sense. So that rate is pretty small, $500 a year. Government emergency services. So let's say the BLM jumped on ODOT's tower, they would be charged 2/3 of the rate that ODOT pays as a base lessee. And then commercial, the same thing. So the rates that we chose were 2/3 because they would still be operating under a co-locator lease with the state.
So if I'm Chip, if I understand this right,
Mhm.
what I do is I form a nonprofit for the purposes of expanding my infrastructure in rural areas so people can get decent cell service. And I form that nonprofit. I get it qualified under our rules here. I get a lease with the Department of State Lands, and I build a tower. And then I rent space in that tower to all of the cell phone companies. And those cell phone companies have now paid only 2/3 what they would normally pay per year, plus whatever their share is of the new nonprofits commercial per year. Is there a way to stop that from happening?
In our definition, cellular does not qualify for emergency or nonprofit or anything. It actually specifically states that in the definitions above.
I think John's point though is that they're the co-locators, so they're taking a free ride on his nonprofit
Mhm.
status. That's an interesting scenario.
Mhm. Well, and yeah, that's why we're asking for input on this pricing here.
And I don't have all the details for that, but the one thing I do know is that every time I've had to negotiate with cell companies, they have smart lawyers. They will look at a scheme like this and they will figure out a way to maximize profits. And it's natural. It's what they do. It's how they make corporate profits and make people happy. So it's just something I wanted to raise the issue. Again, this hill is not high for me.
So I see a chat from Stephanie. Your internet provider co-locator using your structure would get charged $3,300, which is more than your base lease. Yes, because they are commercial and you are nonprofit. But again, we are open to suggestions here on pricing for co-location. So
And for me,
She get-
oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
no, go ahead, Chip.
I'm just thinking of clarification for me. So for me, in my world, at least, cellular communications at $13,200 a year, that's actually a rent that'll be going straight to DSL. But in our situations, in those, it does happen, but there's also a base rent that goes to the carrier that built the tower. So they're not freely co-located on that tower without paying monthly. It's usually monthly. So is that factored into all of this also? So for example, one of the carriers goes in and, builds a tower, it costs them $2 million. And then they have the jurisdiction locally, like Harney or Malheur County, they require that they allow, at least depending on the height of the tower, 1 to 3 potential co-locators on that tower. That's just a requirement to limit proliferation of towers, and which is great. And then so in that scenario, when carrier 1 goes and builds that, carrier 2 wants to come out and co-locate because it fits their coverage needs. And then they are used to going through and paying rent to the tower builder / carrier. And then they're now a subtenant, right, of that leasee or tenant. And then in many situations, there's also for ground space, they'd actually be paying the monthly rent for the underlying property owner. And that happens quite often. But in this scenario, it kind of sounds like, and I just am thinking that I want to win for everybody, but in this situation,
You're cutting out, Chip.
You're cutting out. Chip, we can't. You were cutting out there.
Can you hear me now?
There you are.
Oh, wait, that's a famous turn in a commercial. So you can hear me now. So in essence, what you're saying is 13.2 would go to DSL, but nothing is responsible. The carrier that is co-locating is not responsible to pay the tower owner anything in rent. Is that what I'm hearing?
That
No.
would be they'd have to work it out amongst themselves situation.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead.
So that was one of my questions. So if DSL is taking fees straight from the co-locator, the way that it was done before is that DSL collected 25% of any rent charged from the lessee, the tower owner, to the sublessee. So say you charged $10,000 to your co-locator, you would then turn around and pay 25% of that back to the state. So 2,500, it would be our sublease fees that we would receive. So I am curious if DSL taking the fees straight from the co-locator messes up that relationship of the tower owner and their co-locators.
It actually creates a double lease situation. And that, like I said, that happens. And really what you were used to with that 25% portion of the new co-locator's total rent, we call that a revenue share. And that does happen to some degree still today, but it's very rare. In a lot of situations, what's happening these days is that the carrier that built the tower has the lease with DSL, and then within that lease they have language that dictates that the new co-locator will need to get their own separate ground space from the underlying property owner, and that is negotiated between those two parties, i.e. the $13,200 per year shown here for the co-locator. And then at the same time, then they will also be negotiating a lease with the tower owner, and I don't say it could be a carrier, it could be a tower management company, right? And then they would be negotiating a separate lease with them to co-locate on that tower. Does that make sense?
So they're still in a double lease situation either way?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So I guess the big question then is, are these fees unreasonable? Is 2/3 of the base rent a reasonable ask? What I'm seeing from Stephanie is that that's too much for some of their smaller lessees, even though they're commercial. The size of the company is such that that might be inhibitive.
It is expensive because what they're doing is essentially is the co-locator is leasing space, which is less than, right, the first position tower owner in the lease area. It's less space and they're not building the tower. So, at $13,200 a year, I'd say, yeah, in majority of all scenarios, that's expensive because, it just becomes cost prohibitive. They're carrying two leases, but at the same time, that footprint that they're putting on that land, on DSL land, is such significantly less than what the initial footprint is for that, say, 50 by 50 lease area that has, 150 foot, in some cases, for almost 450 for the tower. So that's taking up less land. So the less land there is, the less rent there is.
Okay.
Less impact.
I think your fees are I think the fees are high across the board here, and compared to where it would have been, if you look at HEC, she says in the chat that they had a couple at $500 a year. Of that $500 a year, they got to keep whatever 400. That's 20%. They got to keep a little less than $400, maybe $380 or whatever the numbers are. Whatever 25%, whatever 75% of 500 does, they got to keep.
Mm-hmm.
Now they're going to go now to get the same amount. They don't just have to charge the 500 that they have to pay for the personal use, right? But they have to recoup the revenue that they had for the share, which would be the other 380. So that fee essentially becomes 880. And I suspect that there will be some that's if HEC wants to maintain their own revenue. And if you look at your numbers throughout that, and we go on the other end on the cellular, in order for if we did a side-by-side comparison, you have to multiply that 13,200 by 4 for it to be the same as the 25%. So I think that the model might be something that you might want to take another look at. once again, OPB doesn't have other people on our towers, and we don't run them as revenue sites, much to my chagrin. And it's not going to affect us on a Department of State land site. So the hill for me is not that great here, but it will affect some of your people in ways that I'm not sure is anticipated. And I think it's going to end up in there being fewer people on towers, fewer people doing things that you may want them to be able to do, because co-location becomes cost prohibitive when they have to pay for both the ground and the space on the tower and in the building.
So can anybody propose a fair percentage or
If we-
amount?
Yeah, so if we kept the same structure where we did a percentage of the base lease, what would that look like?
Oop, I think I lost you again.
We can hear you, Chip. Maybe not.
Sorry, I got a bad internet connection. My apologies, you guys. You know, the 25% was a standard back when we were doing revenue share. Like I said, we don't really do revenue share anymore. It's really rare. It happens, and I have seen some recently that are 25%. But like I said, again, that's kind of gone by the wayside by some of the carriers or tower management companies saying you need to just get ground space on your own, pay us rent, and then you negotiate with the property owner. And they just kind of turned it over to that. But like I said, 25% wasn't out of whack. If it's not enough for DSL, or you're thinking it's not, then it needs to be looked at closely and figure out what's fair, what's market.
So just to use cellular as an example, so if we reduced from 2/3 down to 25% of what a cellular base lease would be, that co-locator would be paying $5,000 a year.
Yeah.
If we kept this structure. And then I do want to recognize that Stephanie's comments about our local commercial being defined as within statewide, the state of Oregon. And she feels like there should be a smaller category with a smaller rate for those types of small businesses. And Stephanie, do you know what is the name of the internet provider? Is it Wilderness Wireless? MyWave. Okay. So yeah, there are several small internet providers in rural areas like that. So we'll definitely take that into consideration. Stephanie also says we lost 2 ranch/farmers at the previous rate. And I don't know that we'll keep the other 2 at $500 a year with the increase in cell phone coverage in our area. We'll see. So yeah, I guess as cell phone increases, the use of radio would likely decrease. And even $500 a year is too much for a local ranch, is what I'm gathering.
It's not just the $500, right? Because it's the $500 plus the amount they have to pay for the space on the tower, plus the actual equipment on the tower, plus the install, and pretty soon the whole project becomes cost prohibitive for some of those smaller entities. And that's a policy choice, right? It's a policy choice what you want to do with your towers and what businesses you want to promote and how you want that to happen. And of course, you're restricted by your school trust obligations. But this scheme on the lower end for personal, for research, scientific, small commercial, I know I used a new term there, but small commercial and non-commercial, nonprofit categories, this is a dramatic change from the 25% revenue share. It makes more sense when you start getting into the cellular and the national, international commercial, because there's enough economy of scale and enough upside for them to still be able to make good profit and make the business model make sense. But you might want to consider bifurcating.
Sure. Travis, I just want to see if you have any input from kind of a bigger internet company viewpoint.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And I've reached out to see if I could get some lease rates that we currently have going on. Yeah, I'm probably like Chip was closer to 25%, thinking that's a little more realistic. I know we're a fairly large company. So at the end of the day, I don't know that honestly it'll make much difference.
Okay. Okay, so John, yeah, I definitely want to say that all these, John and Stephanie, these comments are definitely heard, and it seems like we need to spend some time reevaluating this section. And we expected that. We expected to have some pretty good discussion about co-locator fees specifically and fees in general. So I definitely think we'll be taking another look at this in
Yeah, well said, Amber. I think that we can look at that. Try the model with 25%, see what it looks like too, but then also try introducing Stephanie's idea about, I'm doing air quotes again because it irritates everybody, a regional commercial that's smaller than local too, and see how that would fit into the structure. The reason I'm chiming in now though is just to keep us on track with time. We're getting close to about 10 minutes till when we committed to wrap up. So we can move on from this section and just know that DSL staff will take a dive into it.
Actually, we're kind of at a good stopping point with the fees.
Okay.
And then we can continue this section later on, and we will we'll go revisit that, and we'll revisit our rate study tables as well to kind of take your guys' comments into consideration and see if we can't pull out anything more with co-location fees and things like that. And for those of you that do commercial co-location, if you guys can send us any information, we would really appreciate it. We had a heck of a time trying to pull that information from the Western states data that we got. So it was really difficult to try to figure it out because they were all over the place. So if you can send us anything, that would be super helpful. And we'll be working on that.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Did your revenue projection run a comparison between the co-locator fees currently generated that are 25% revenue share and the new proposal?
Yes, there wasn't that many co-locators included because the information is just not very organized. But there were 2 co-locators on cell leases that we know what they're being charged, and it was really similar. Basically, the fees that we were proposing were almost exactly the same as what they were being charged and paying to the state anyways. Other than that, there's wasn't very many co-locators included in the rate study. There's most of the co-locators honestly aren't being charged. So you have these co-location agreements in place, but ODOT's not charging OPB fees and likewise. So that would be a change too, to where, although you guys both have a base lease, so there's no co-locator fees on top of that. But there are some instances where we have co-locators that aren't charged any fees by the owners of the towers.
What can you tell me a little bit about what kind of co-locators those are that are not getting charged fees?
Some of them are like U of O, and it's for wildfire cameras or some sort of scientific research kind of a thing. Some pretty very low impact stuff.
With
Yeah.
a community benefit.
Yeah.
Those are the ones that come to mind.
But after this meeting, I could compile that information and send it out if you want to see that.
I think I've said enough about what my thoughts are on it that you probably should be able to take it and run without me asking for anything more.
Okay.
I'd hate to see you have to do a model like you did with your other spreadsheet. Yeah, I won't ask for that.
So Sheena, are you suggesting this is our ending point for today?
I think so. Our language was kind of the same with having the minimum bid awarded through public auction. So I will insert kind of the same language that we did in the compensation section. It says notwithstanding that we talked about, or that John proposed earlier, and then we're going to wordsmith. So I'll kind of add that here just to make it consistent. This is also consistent. It's a 3% increase. And again, number 7, this is all the same exact wording, copied and pasted essentially from the compensation section that just basically says the co-locators are pretty well, you know, it's basically the same terms for how compensation get paid, the increaser and things like that. The difference here is in number 8. And this is where, in the event the base lease is terminated, either by default or by mutual agreement between the lessee and the department, or is not renewed, a co-location lessee may be offered the option to become the base lessee if one of the following conditions are met. And then a co-locator lessee purchases the structures and buildings authorized under the base lease. Proof of purchase must be provided to the department, or in the event of the structures and buildings become property of the state through abandonment or seizure, the department may offer the base lease to the existing co-location lessees through competitive bidding for purchase of the structures and buildings. So that would be how, in the event the base lease is lost for whatever reason, a co-location lessee could take that over and keep the site operating.
Assuming equipment wasn't removed.
Assuming equipment wasn't removed, yeah.
Let's,
On section A, I think it's a good process. A couple of things I noticed as I'm reading these is use co-location lease, and that's real clear, and use base lease, and that's real clear. And there are a couple of times in, I think 6, 7, and 8 that you just use lease, and you might want to use the tags in front of them.
Yep.
You might go back and look at that. And then on the on your last sentence on B, on 8B, I could see a situation where the department would, and maybe you've made this choice, it is a choice, would end up with a offering the base lease through competitive bidding at an amount that would be less than what the rate should be, than what your minimum rate should be, right? If you only have one, especially if you only have 1 or 2 or a few people on that base lease as a co-locator, your competitive bidding may end up with an amount that is less than your minimum amount for those services that you have up above, right?
We wouldn't be allowed to take anything below the minimum.
Then you might want to add at your very last words there, in no event less than the amount specified and then your minimum compensation section.
it does say which is greater in that section as well.
Mhm.
But I'm trying to bring us to a close here if everybody's okay with that. Feels like we're at the right spot. John, thank you for your sharp eyes on structural, looking at the rules. I mean, we've read this together, and it's interesting the things that pop up when you get new eyes looking at it, and it's, oh yeah, that doesn't make sense. But thank you everybody for participation. I want to make sure and share information about the next meeting right now. But also before I do that, Aaron, thank you so much for note taking again. Did you have any last questions of clarification before we terminate the meeting?
We go back over all of this again.
Hold on, you're breaking up.
Aaron.
Thank you for all your work, Aaron. And also I neglected to thank Lonnie at the beginning of the meeting. She's behind the scenes. She's the one that's been helping us make sure we have a virtual meeting platform and greasing wheels behind the scenes for making sure we're hitting the right steps in our rulemaking process. So thank you, Lonnie. So we are proposing October 27th of 2021 at 1:30 for our next meeting. That gives us 6 weeks and should be slightly less busy weeks than the last 6 weeks. So we should be able to get materials out to you in plenty of time. And what we'll do is go ahead and set up an invitation for that. And then if we get a lot of resistance, like that date isn't working, then we can try a poll. It just seemed like that far out towards the end of October, we should have a good chance of grabbing everybody. So look for that invitation. Amber and Sheena, thank you both so much for all of your work behind the scenes and your work in leading this discussion today. It really went well. I feel like there's a lot of good work done today. I think we wore out all of Aaron's pens and highlighters. And so it was very productive without question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for your input. This really helps us get a good program going.
We appreciate your expertise.
Well, with that, barring any last minute questions, I'll just thank everybody one last time. And it looks like Stephanie's saying a virtual goodbye through the chat. So thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.